Okay, so the last part of our module on conquest and colonization talks about the Spanish mission system, which was probably one of the largest impacts on the indigenous population in Florida. Um, and certainly, when we look at today, um, we don't find a lot of evidence of it, but that's not because it didn't produce a lasting effect, but because most of the buildings just don't exist anymore. But it does point to a large scale effort by the Spanish government to assimilate, um, but also um, develop trade networks with the indigenous population. So the Spanish mission system in Florida is part of a larger um, portion of the colonial system. The Spanish mission system that we see in the West is much more lasting, um, certainly much more wealthy, and more successful, but it still shares a great deal with what's going on within Florida. So the beginnings of the mission system start, of course, with Menendez and his efforts to um, colonize. So the first order that he actually approaches is the Dominican order, the order of friars and preachers to come to Florida. However, they decline the invitation. Upon their declining, he goes to declining the offer. He goes to the Order of the Jesuits, or the Order of Jesus, and they accept. And they send three missionaries with the original voyage to the area. In 1567, three more arrive, and then they're gradually they begin to increase their numbers. So from this, they go and create a center of operations in Havana that will direct activities not just in Florida, but also in Mexico and as well in other portions of the Spanish Empire. But the ones in Florida are under the control of this provincial house in Havana. We have early missions that begin to develop along the Florida and Georgia coast. And you can see the ones, I believe they're in blue. These are the very early um, Jesuit missions that develop. Um, Most of them, however, do not last very long. So, one of the big arguments that the Jesuits have, and this brings in a conflict between Menendez and the Jesuit order itself, is that Menendez does not allow for the Jesuits to move into unprotected area without having some sort of protection. So they're having to go with soldiers, and so um, the Jesuit missions contact through the ranks of their order, all the way up to the top guy, and basically say, look, we want to explore, we want to meet with the indigenous people and try and convert them, but we can't do it with the Spanish soldiers hanging around. Um, they're going to see that as a threat, and they're going to resist efforts. We want them, remember, the Spanish want the native population to convert, but willingly. You obviously do not want to force anyone to convert. So what happens is this, like, Church versus Menendez disagreement that eventually leads to Menendez letting the Jesuits move outside of the territory um, without soldiers. And so, what leads up to this effort? In 1560, they capture Don Luis, who is a native from the Chesapeake area, who is taken captive. He's brought to the Jesuits and educated and converts to Christianity, hence his Spanish name, Don Luis. When you're baptized, you get a new name because you are a new person in Christ. Um, and so basically, what Don Luis begins to do is tell the Jesuits about where he's from, which is up in the Chesapeake, Bahia de Santa Maria. Um, and so he convinces the Jesuits that, hey, you bring me here, I can convert all of these people. You're going to have huge success. They really are hungry for Christianity. It'll be great. And so this is what convinces the Jesuits that this is where they need to go without soldiers to, prevent the success. But they will take Don Luis and basically take him up there and convert all these people, and there'll be a huge raging success, and the church will be so proud and all that. So Menendez relents and says, okay, fine. At the last minute, Menendez says, look, I'll give you some soldiers to take with you. And they say, no, we don't want any. Let's move on. So they move on. They go up into the Chesapeake area. Eventually, what, of course, ends up happening is they're massacred. And I think there were 7 of them. I'm not sure if I have it in here or not. I don't think I do. But I think there were 7 of them. Anyway, they're referred to as the martyrs of Florida. Because, again, Florida encompasses all of North America at this point. This is before Jamestown and the British colony. Basically, as a result of this, the Jesuits say, peace out. We are not going to be working with you in Florida anymore. Menendez approaches the Franciscan order about coming to Florida, and they agree. So in 1573, you have the first Franciscans that come, and these are the men that will represent the mission system as it progresses. And so starting in 1595, they begin to branch out from Santa Elena and San Agustin, and they begin settling all of these different missions, and these are the ones that are marked in red. So obviously a lot more success. They have some missions that are very long-standing, and you'll notice that there's several that are long-term that they return to, like the Wale missions of Georgia and South Carolina are prior missions that they revisit. Now, under the Franciscan mission system, there are 2 different types of missions. They're the Doctrinas, and then there's the Visitas. The Doctrinas are the missions where Mass is said on a daily basis. They're usually located in principal towns, and you have 1 or 2 priests that are assigned to that specific mission. The Visitas missions are ones where there's no resident priest, but you have a priest that comes sporadically as needed. So think of it this way. The Doctrinas is where the doctrine is taught. The people, they have schools, they have the church, and so this is their effort to convert larger numbers of people. If it's a smaller mission that doesn't, let's say it's on the interior, maybe along the St. Johns River or something like that, where there's not as many people, but the potential is still there, then they will use it as a visitas. They will visit it. They will not stay there on a permanent basis. Mission San Luis in Tallahassee is a great example, and there's the link to the website down there, which you probably can't click on, but you can pull it up. If you've been there, you've seen the buildings and all of that, but it gives you an idea of what it looked like, of what the missions resembled. There were interior, like in the church, it's the wattle and daub construction, so it's that plaster, but it's decorated on the interior. Again, the missions are using money raised by selling off the excess surplus of crops that the Indians are giving them, and they begin trading for crosses and iconography so that they can decorate the church and all of that. 1586, we have the first raid on St. Augustine, and this was by Francis Drake, and it was by direct order of Queen Elizabeth that Drake goes into the New World and he begins to, as part of the Anglo-Spanish War from 1585 to 1604, he raids different Spanish settlements. He hits the Caribbean. I believe he hits parts of Mexico, but St. Augustine is probably the last raid that he'll hit. But basically, he burns the city to the ground. Um, and I forgot to mention the fact of how how the French are taken out, because this is Drake is seeking to avenge the deaths of the Protestants that were put to death by Menendez at Matanzas. If you're familiar with the history of the Matanzas area, you know that the French were, when they came down to hit St. Augustine and to attack the Spanish there. And a storm came along. We don't know if it's a hurricane or not, and it drove them further south, where roughly where Fort Matanzas is located today. They're beached and they're camping out, and Pedro basically leads an army down there to um, basically attack them. And so he surprises them. The French, some of them surrender, some of them refuse to surrender, but all of them are murdered. So Jean Ribaud, included, is put to the sword at Matanzas, and that's where you get the name Matanzas, which means slaughter. Anyway, Drake is avenging the deaths of these men. What's funny is they had a watchtower on Anastasia Island that gave the indication that um, there were ships coming in and they were not friendly, that they were British. The guards at the watchtower place the flag and then they hightail it out of there. The people in the town basically abandon the town, they get out. Keep in mind, the fort is wooden, the walls are wooden, all the houses are wooden, so it's not hard for Drake to burn basically the town down. But he basically goes through and he plunders and then he sets fire to everything. In 1597, you have what many argue would be a internal issue amongst the Wale that begins to involve European control. Now, there are a number of historians who argue that this was the Wale uprising against the Europeans, against the Spanish. However, one of the former historians at UNF began in one of his classes to look at the records of this uprising, and they found out, or at least uncovered, that this wasn't an act against Europeans particularly, but it was more a power play between different chiefs, and the Europeans unfortunately got caught in the middle. But essentially, on Santa Catalina de Wale, which is St. Catherine's Island, you had a number of friars who were murdered. Many point to the fact that one of these friars reprimanded a young warrior who was eventually going to become the paramount chief for practicing polygamy. Of course, this was against Catholic teachings, and so this warrior comes back or orders the death of the friar, and so it's known as Juanilo's uprising, because Don Juan or Juanilo was the young warrior. But what we have found in the records is that Juanilo was basically the chosen heir, and he was in a power play with another chief. And because it seemed that the Wale, or this particular chief of the Wale, had close connections to the Spanish through the mission system, the friars actually become victims of this power play, that you're going to eliminate his allies in order to weaken his position. And what ends up happening, of course, is that the Spanish launch a retaliatory attack against the Wale, and they slaughter the people who are responsible for the death of the friars. Um, St. Catherine's Island is isolated. You can't get to it except by boat. But I've been there, and it's a very interesting island because there's a number of different historical sites there. But the Indian village or the mission that was part of the Indian village um, is unfortunately sinking into the river. There's a nearby river, and you can see the top right picture where the river is wearing away a portion of the mission. But they have located the church. They have located the burial ground of the friars that were killed, where they were buried, which seems to indicate that they weren't the intended target of the Wale. Because why would you bury them? Why wouldn't you just leave them out and then completely abandon the site? And that's not what happened. So anyway, the evidence seems to point in a different direction, but nonetheless, these are some recreations of some of the pictures of the mission itself. And of course, after 1597, it does reemerge as another. There's successive friars that do come and reestablish the mission. So, as I mentioned, 1593, this Council on Indies holds a tribunal. Basically, why are we in Florida, and what the heck are we doing here? Um, they basically hear pros and cons from everybody, and of course, the Wally uprising in 1597 and Drake's raid in 1586 are concerns. Um, and the governor basically says, "Look, you got to give us more money. You got to give us more financial support. The crown needs to support us more." Um, and the council says, "Okay, I think we can make that recommendation. Hopefully that will happen. It doesn't, but hopefully it would happen, and it doesn't. But all in all." The tribunal rules that Florida should stay as a colony, and this is when they decide to shut down Santa Elena and bring all of the resources into St. Augustine, namely because of its proximity to the Gulf Stream, but also because of the mission system that um, is so vital to Spain's conquest. So again, we kind of look at the same thing. The Crown recommends or needs to commit to the colony. In other words, this is what the governor is saying. The situato needs to be more regular, which is something that they try to do. It doesn't happen. You need additional support from the military. This is that same argument between church and state. You need to increase the number of people that we can bring in as soldiers. That also doesn't happen. You need better communication, and the colony funds need to be better managed. There's some inroads in that area, but not a lot. So in 1633, you have the governor essentially um, recognizing a practical problem, and that is that the Timucua and the Wale, all along the coast and in the interior part of North Florida around Jacksonville, probably close to like Lake City, have died off in major numbers. And most of that is because of disease. Contact with Europeans bring smallpox and other diseases that kill off the people in record numbers. And so they begin looking for other people that they can partner with. And so the Appalachee become a new target for missions, but also for trade. Now, one of the things that DeSoto does argue, and some of the explorers before him, is that the Appalachia area seems to be a very lucrative area, an area of great economic and agricultural productivity. And so the Spanish begin making inroads with the Appalachia, and eventually the mission system begins to um, move in that direction. Now, as I said, the Wale are diminishing in numbers, great numbers. So slowly but surely, those colonies that were up and down the South Carolina and Georgia coast become obsolete, and the friars who are assigned to them begin to move more towards the center part of the state and into the Appalachia area. One of the other things is that you have the construction of the Camino Real, which is the road that leads into the Appalachian Territory. And eventually it will link up to Pensacola. And so it becomes a road between Pensacola and St. Augustine, so that goods can be moved back and forth. Now, with the rise of the Appalachia, and you noticed on the map of the Presidios that there were a number of forts that began to be built along the Gulf Coast. What slowly begins to happen is those forts, rather than trading with St. Augustine, begin to trade with Havana. And so you almost have this split of Spanish trade between St. Augustine in Spain and then Havana, and then you begin to see these forts along the Gulf Coast that begin to trade directly with Havana rather than going through St. Augustine. Why is that a major issue? Well, it's because there's a portion of the profits that the people in St. Augustine are no longer getting. And so it kind of cuts out the middleman. St. Augustine was the middleman. And so many of the merchants in St. Augustine begin to see a reduction in profits because of this. Not really a lot that they can do because Havana is the center of Spanish control in the area. The merchants there are much happier dealing with the Gulf Coast people rather than sending all of their material to St. Augustine because, again, they recognize that they don't have to pay as much as well as the people along the Gulf Coast who don't have to pay as much because they're not going through a middleman. The Sabana system is this system that I had mentioned before, where the natives owed a debt of gratitude or debt to their chief, to this cacique. And so they would give a portion of their fields to the chiefs. Well, when the friars come in and they establish their missions, they are also given land to grow crops, but they also take a portion of the individual native fields as well. So they're getting a portion from that, and that is what they use. They sell in order to buy, items for the church and robes and all of, iconography and all that. So it's almost like they're getting kind of screwed over twice because the Indians are not only providing labor to work in the fields of the friars, because the friars themselves are not harvesting their crops. They rely upon the natives to do that because that's part of their catechism and their lesson about learning about Christianity. But then they also get a portion of their crops from the natives themselves. So it's kind of a shady deal. Spanish governor St. Augustine required each village to provide labor in the form of transporting goods. And so you didn't have carts, you didn't necessarily have horses. So what many of these laborers would do is carry goods back and forth between the Appalachian Territory and St. Augustine by foot, and usually carrying heavy loads to St. Augustine. So that's how goods moved from the Appalachian Territory to St. Augustine. Yeah, and so it's kind of obviously a little bit like the encomienda system in the fact that it relies upon the exploitation of native labor. Cattle remain in Florida, and they grow. Now, here's the thing: is that each of the explorers that came to Florida, when their expedition fails and they flee, they leave the cattle, and so the cattle just kind of roam free, and it's open range. Over time, the natives begin to use the cattle industry in order, like the Spanish hire them to round up the cattle and all of that stuff. As the natives begin to die off, the Spanish begin to fill those positions. And so you have slowly but surely this cattle industry that begins to develop within Florida. Spanish government requires that cattle be driven into St. Augustine every year, and that they will be shipped off for slaughter. And then the government collects a head tax on each of the heads of cattle. this is another trade item that begins to be shipped through Havana. And so the cattlemen begin to ship the cattle from the Gulf Coast as opposed to St. Augustine, and therefore they don't have to pay the head tax to the governor. Of course, the governor is wise to this and understands what's going on, but there's really not much he can do about it because, again, Havana trumps what's going on in St. Augustine because Havana is a much more powerful um, city, and the interests that are there have the king's ear, and so there's really not much they can do about it. There are four main cattle ranching areas: Tallahassee, obviously, Gainesville, St. Augustine, and then along the up and down the St. Johns River. But this is the beginning of the Florida cattle industry, and it does not go away when the Spanish leave at the end of the first Spanish period. It sticks around for quite a while. Gradually, the Appalachian Indians rebel, mostly because of this forced labor. Um, and what happens is, in some cases, the governor will come in and say, well, if you can't get workmen or you can't get labor to move these goods between your region and St. Augustine, well, then I'll just make you do it. And so the chiefs are like, hey, I don't do manual labor. This isn't going to work. So they usually will rebel. The other thing is that in the midst of this, you have the construction of the Castillo de San Marcos, the masonry fort that basically is built on the foundation, the site of the other forts. And so the Castillo is built by Indian labor. And so all of these things kind of force a number of different rebellions to take place within the Appalachian Territory. Bishop Calderon's letter, hopefully you will have read that. And what's interesting is he's basically doing an inspection of the mission system. And what he says is that he confirms 13,000 Indians and Spaniards. He restores a number of doctrinas. He helps people. He spends 11,000 pesos to help the natives and the friars. Does this sound kind of like an exaggeration? Probably. Does he do all of this stuff? Maybe. But what he's basically saying, within the letter, he mentions that he administers confirmation. Bishops are the only ones that can really do that. So for years, they've not had any confirmations among the Indians. But he seems to be okay with some kind of murky areas where the Indians have reverted back to a little bit of their old mythology. They blend it with Christianity, but then they also bring in their own kind of take on Christianity. In some cases, and he mentions this in the letters, that he corrects faults and abuses. So he does do some correction in terms of what is being taught within the missions, but for the most part, he's casting it in a very positive light. And this letter is written to Queen Mariana, who was a regent over the crown of Spain. But basically, it's a very positive message. So, really and truly, this slide should be first. Robert Searles raid in 1668. He's a privateer that attacks St. Augustine and basically, again, burns the city to the ground. And he enslaves a number of the African native and mixed race inhabitants. So, again, not a lot of people in St. Augustine, but this is a very hard lesson for them to learn. And this is primarily what brings Queen Mariana's decision to build the Castillo de San Marcos to the forefront. The other thing to remember is that this raid shows to the Spanish that we're not in the same realm that we were before, that this is a different international this is a different world. Obviously, by 1668, the British have arrived on the scene in Jamestown. and they're expanding their territory. The Dutch are in New Amsterdam, and so it's a different place. Spain is not the only people dealing or living within North America now, and so it basically makes them have to kind of have a wake up call. So the Castillo was built obviously out of coquina. It's mined from the quarry on Anastasia Island. Um, Workers are brought from Havana, but of course the major source of labor are the natives. Construction lasts 23 years. So it's a heavy duty um, construction project. Um, what's interesting, and this is something they didn't know about coquina when they built it, is that when cannon hit the walls, the cannon become absorbed by the coquina. And this is something that James Oglethorpe learns a very difficult lesson about. But you have British begin to impact the Spanish colony holdings within Florida. James Moore is the governor of South Carolina, and he uses Indian troops to attack the Spanish. And he is essentially responsible for the destruction of the Spanish missions. He goes through, he attacks all of the missions along the coast, and then moves inland to the Appalachie, and he basically lays waste to all of them. He runs into some resistance, but very little, which of course ends up only kind of fueling his fire. But he does eventually attack St. Augustine. He tries to starve the city into submission, and about the time that um, he thinks he's about to win, reinforcements come in um, from Havana, and he ends up retreating. But the lasting damage is there. He has ended the Spanish missions in Florida, and Spain will not reinvest in those. All right, so one of the side effects of the British being so close, because obviously the British come into South Carolina, and they're not far from Spanish Florida. So one of the effects of the British Indian policy is the Yamasee War in 1715. And what basically happens is the Yamasee had been used by the British as Indian troops, and what they would do was they would use the Yamasee to attack Spanish forts and missions off and on during the period of expansion of British interest in South Carolina. But what happens is that the British basically use credit. Well, basically, what the Indians are doing is they're buying goods on credit. And so, like, they might buy crops, they might buy cloth, trade goods from the British. And in response, the British keep hiking up the interest rates. And so it takes the Yamasee a little while, but they eventually rebel against the British interests. And so this 1715 rebellion is essentially the British, a war by the Yamasee against the British because of this policy. And of course, the British end up forcing the Yamasee off of their land, and the Yamasee flee. What's ironic is they end up coming into Spanish territory, and they seek asylum within Spanish Florida. They end up living right outside of the Castillo, within sight of the fort. The Spanish certainly don't, they welcome them, but they're also very leery of having the Yamasee so close. And so what they end up doing is creating settlements where the Yamasee are scattered throughout Spanish Florida. You do still have some Yamasee that stay in South Carolina, but the Spanish policy at this point, of course, is that they want small numbers of Yamasee in concentrations. So their idea is to scatter them across the different settlements, which is kind of ironic. But there is a portion of the Yamasee that stay in Florida and are still here in Florida. Another outcome of the Spanish policy towards British is the creation of Fort Mose. And this is in 1693, you have the Spanish king announce that any slaves that escape from British territory that come to Florida could be made free. All they have to do is they have to agree to serve in the Spanish military and convert to Roman Catholicism. This solves a number of different problems. The Spanish needed labor, they needed people. And so you have this huge number of slaves that escape into Spanish Florida. There's actually a case where there's a slave rebellion in Stono, where the slaves were actually on their way to St. Augustine when they rebelled. There was a large number of slaves that rebelled. Unfortunately, the rebellion was put down before they could make it. But slaves would also be the front line against the British attack, and you'll see what I'm talking about in just a second when I show you the map. But this was economic warfare as much as it was political and social welfare, because it undermined the plantation system that the British relied on. Because you had the ability of slaves to escape to Florida, and they were very close. So one of the things that the British do is they create a buffer colony in Georgia. And at first, the colony outlaws slavery. So if you were in the colony of Georgia at that time and you saw an African person walking through or walking along the street, you could pretty much guess that that person was an escaped slave, and they would be arrested. And then, of course, sent back to the plantation. With this large influx of freed slaves, the Spanish create the town of Fort Mose, El Pueblo de Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, 1738. That's quite a name. The population totals about 100, but they are the first line of defense for St. Augustine. And when you take a look, you'll see what I'm talking about. Fort Mose is out here on the northern periphery of the town. Oh, wait, my work is working well. You have the Indian village, which is Nombre de Dios, which today is the mission grounds. But this was one of the few missions that survives into or after Moore's attack on St. Augustine, but that's because it's so close to the city. And then you have the fort. Now, in the event of an attack, the residents would move into the fort, just like the other residents of St. Augustine. But they would be able to head off any major attack. Fort Mose is located kind of on the north section of town, but this is the only remnant of it. There's an island out in the Tolomato Creek. I think it's Tolomato River, maybe. And you can see it. There's a state park there now, which has a great interpretive center. But you can kind of see what remains of the fort. The leader of the fort, of course, is Francisco Menendez, and he plays a major role because he's the one who basically leads a British defeat in the Battle of, or he doesn't lead, well, he leads the militia into defeating the British at the Battle of Bloody Mose. And this is when Oglethorpe attacks St. Augustine. They come by land, and of course, Fort Mose does exactly what it's supposed to do, and it's the first line of defense. And so Menendez is one who leads the militia, the black militia, against the British and ultimately defeat them. Menendez has an interesting history. He's of mixed Portuguese and Ingolese race. He arrives in South Carolina. He escapes to St. Augustine. He's eventually given his freedom by the governor, and then made the head of the settlement out at Fort Mose. He does go to sea. This is after the first Spanish period. He goes to sea and helps attack British ships and seize their cargo. He's captured by the British and then sold into slavery. And the Spanish crown actually negotiates with the British crown for his release. So he's a very, very high status, or has a very high status with the crown, which is very unusual for a former slave. But as I mentioned, Oglethorpe attacks the city of St. Augustine during the War of Jenkins' Ear, which pitted Spain against Great Britain from 1739 to 1748. Oglethorpe, of course, is the governor of Georgia. He comes down by land, but also by sea. The ships park it right out off of St. Anastasia Island, and they attack the city from that position. And what he learns, he has a 27-day bombardment of the Castillo starting June 24th, is that the fort really is impenetrable because the cannonballs that he fires into the fort walls just become embedded in the wall because it's loosely packed shell, which is what the fort is made out of, coquina, and so it's loosely packed shell. And so when it has a bombardment from some outside object, all it does is just crush the shell, but it doesn't go all the way through the wall. So even today, you can still see the cannonballs that are lodged in the wall of the fort. He eventually gives it up, though. They do capture Fort Mose at one point. Once the residents of Fort Mose retreat into the city, they do this at night after they have seen the British coming. But then Menendez and his men attack Fort Mose the next day and defeat the British in the Battle of Bloody Mose. The Spanish ships make it through the blockade, the British blockade, and resupply the Castillo. Oglethorpe decides, hey, let's assault the fort by land, but of course eventually changes his mind once the Spanish ships make it through the blockade, and he retreats back to Georgia. But one of the things to remember about the War of Jenkins' Ear is that it will become, with the 7 Years' War, that's what it's known on the continent, it will turn Florida or hand Florida back, or I'm sorry, not back, but it will hand Florida to the British, and the Spanish are no longer the caretakers of Florida. Now, in the last years of the 7 Years' War, British forces capture Havana. And so for this one city that's held by British forces, Spain trades the entire colony of Florida in order to have Havana back. So that's kind of a very big, very big trade. But it also tells you exactly how they viewed Florida in terms of its value. So this ends the Spanish period. It ends the Spanish mission period. You do have a few missions that are still around, but they're ones that are very, very close to St. Augustine, literally within firing distance of the Castillo. None of the other missions survive. And so our next topic will be the British period, which is a very short topic, but it will be hopefully interesting. But anyway, sorry for the long module. I tried to kind of cut it down and it didn't work as well as I wanted it to, but believe it or not, I actually did cut down quite a bit. So if you have questions, let me know. I've included the readings as well as the slide handout so that you can take notes while you're watching all of the slides and listening to my dull voice. But hopefully this was interesting, and if you have questions, let me know. And I will have the quiz up momentarily.